We have a double Parshah this week. As you may recall, last week when Pinchas falls after the 17th of Tammuz, then Mattot and Masai are combined in a double portion to get in the 3 haftorot of admonition before Tisha B'Av. So, as you might guess, then Mattot and Masai are put together this week in a double Parsha. And the second triennial is a little bit of Mattot and a little bit of Masai. M&M's, melts in your mouth, not in your hands. Let's go ahead and start with the bracha for the reading and studying of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. The second triennial is chapter 32, verse 1 through chapter 33, verse 49. Let's see, Ellen sent a message. What is she saying? She's going to be a few minutes late. So this is the 9th and 10th, the final 2 parshiot of the book of Bamidbar, the 42nd and 43rd Torah portions of 54 total. We will talk about the overviews individually as we get into each Parshah. Mattot first, and Mattot are tribal leaders, plural. And if you're in Hertz, it's on page 707, chapter 32, verse 1. Mattot emphasizes oaths and vows, which we covered last year in the first triennial and the war against Midian, the settlement of the tribes of Ruvain and Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And also Bilam meets his end by the sword, which we read, we skipped ahead at when we were in the Torah portion Balak. And just to refresh your memory, since it's not in the triennial that we will be covering this morning, in chapter 31, verses 6 through 9 of Mattot, we read about Bilam's end. Moshe sent 1,000 from each tribe to the army, them and Pinchas, son of Eleazar the Kohen, to the army with the sacred vessels and the trumpets in his hand. They mounted a campaign against Midian, as God had commanded Moshe, and they killed every male. They killed the Midianite kings upon those they had slain, Evi, Rechem, Sur, Hur, and Reva, the 5 kings of Midian, and Bilam, son of Beor, they killed with the sword. Bnei Yisrael took captive the Midianite women and their children, all their livestock, flocks, and wealth they took as booty.
Stuart, for sake of time, Moses married a Midianite woman, and his father-in-law was Midianite, correct?
That is correct.
So where did this, because I'm confused now with timing, where did this take place after he had married?
Oh, yes, ma'am. This so is, first of all, Moses married Zipporah before he was called by God to free the Jews.
So how did he reconcile killing all her people?
Because the Midianites were complicit. It was Balak, king of Moab, who made a covenant with Midian to curse the Jews and kill them in battle, which we read in Balak just 2 parshiot ago.
So is Jethro still alive at this point?
I have no idea.
Don't forget, this is at the end of the 40 years in the desert.
Right. Correct. Okay. Yeah.
There's a big gap in the continuity.
That's where I get confused. What happened first and last in the movie?
The sin of the spies happened 38 years ago.
Okay.
Okay, and that's when God said you're going to die in the wilderness. So they're now at the edge of the promised land, ready to go in and conquer. They just had 2 successful victories against Sihon and Og, east of the Jordan. So yeah, this is a lot later in time.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Now, before I go into the text, excuse me. Good morning, Patricia and Lily. Glad you could join us. I'm going to read some of the code overview for Mattot, and then a little bit from Hertz, and then we'll dive into the text. And I hope you'll forgive me. I'm a little hoarse this morning, so my voice might be a little gravelly. I'm an understudy for Marlon Brando in The Godfather.
No, that's because of your debut on the streaming. I mean, you didn't need a microphone sound like you were in the Lincoln Center. That's
Thank
why
you.
you're hoarse.
No, that's my
No.
normal voice when I lead services, as
Well,
you
it
should
came
know.
over the Zooming. It came on the streaming really professional.
Well, thank you. Well, that I guess it was kind to those that the camera was pointed to, but thank you. Parshat Mattot covers 3 main subjects: the laws of vows and oaths, the war against Midian, the settlement of the tribes of Reuven and Gad. The second and third of these 3 fit well into the historical flow of the Torah. The war against Midian is the third and final act in the drama of Israel's confrontation with the Moab-Midian alliance, whose story began in Parshat Balak. The settlement of the 2 tribes of Reuven and Gad is the next phase of the conquest of the land of Israel, begun at the end of Parshat Chukat and continuing through the book of Joshua and beyond, which of course Joshua is the first book of the Tanakh after the Torah, 5 books. What then are the laws of vows and oaths? Like the other legal passages of Torah, we would expect to find these laws in Exodus or Leviticus. So why are they in fact here? It must be that these laws have a particular relevance to the subject of conquering and settling the land of Israel. This will be clear when we review the events that preceded this Parshah and which leads into it as follows. As we explained previously, the Jewish people slide into the idolatry of Peor, and their harlotry with the Moabite Midianite women actually began as a misunderstanding of the way they were meant to be involved in the physical world. They knew that their parents' generation had been sentenced to live in the desert for 40 years after the incident of the spies, because they had shunned the challenges of such involvement. Standing at the threshold of the promised land, they were poised to accept this challenge and resolved not to repeat their parents' errors. They were ready to attack the materiality of the physical world and infuse it with God consciousness. Now, when I read these overviews to you, just because I'm reading this overview doesn't mean that it's the only way you should be looking at this or thinking of this. Know that it's Chabad Lubavitch philosophy, and that's infused throughout the books of Kahos, the books of the Torah. It's not the only view, it's their view. And you're free to use and accept what you want, question what you wish, and we move on. However, their impetuous enthusiasm led them to err. They overlooked the need to be cautious. As Eve had done with the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they fell into the trap of overestimating their holiness and thinking that their sublime spiritual consciousness and zeal made them invincible and immune to the machinations of evil. They knew that the purpose of life is to make all of reality into a home for God. And they had learned from Jethro's conversion and Balaam's prophecies that in order for this to happen, even the lowest, most anti-holy elements of reality must be elevated in the holiness. Thus, they reasoned they too must experience these dangerous but powerful energies of lust and unholy spirituality, in order, of course, to elevate them back to their source in holiness. But of course, they were wrong. If one is to throw caution to the wind and risk everything, it should be the opposite direction, to combat evil, as Pinchas graphically demonstrated. Although we should not shun the challenge of engaging the materiality of this world directly, we must be duly aware of its potential to divert us and corrupt our intentions. What is that old saying? The road to is paved with good intentions. The road to what? I forget. What?
The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
There you go. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Hence, the penitence of the laws of vows and oaths. Through these laws, a person can set up boundaries for himself where he feels they are needed, as we will explain further on. The next subject of this parashah, the war with Midian, can now be seen as a logical follow-through from the laws of vows and oaths. Those laws are the spiritual correction of the error of Peor, and the battle with Midian is the effort to uproot the source of this error. The settlement of the tribes of Reuven and Gad is also a development of the same theme. These tribes wished to settle in the territory that Moses had conquered from Sihon and Og on the east side of the Jordan. God did not intend the Jews to settle this land at this point in history. These tribes reasoned, however, that the holiness of the land of Israel proper was greater than the land outside his boundaries. Therefore, it was crucial to elevate the unholy land as well. Their argument was therefore a variation on the same theme as before. As we will see, however, this time they were partially right, and their understanding of an important lesson for us regarding our relationship to the physical world. All three subjects of Parshat Mattot then are relevant to the impending entry into the land of Israel. On the personal level as well, they are relevant to each of us individually in our encounter with the material world and to our generation collectively, standing as we are on the threshold of the messianic redemption. So it is not in my desire to elevate holiness and conquer evil. The Torah isn't saying that I should go to a house of ill repute and engage the services of a zonah in order to combat evil and elevate those sparks in the holiness. And that's basically where I believe this philosophy is coming from. We know the difference between right and wrong, and we must confront evil when we see it. And we can't confront evil by participating in the evil and then hoping that we can conquer the evil by our participation. It is incumbent upon us to always elevate, never descend. Bring those around you up, not let them bring you down.
It's also something that I have experienced, that going into a place of ill repute because there's something that's needed there, that it gave me an opportunity to converse with an individual about something related to living the Torah life. I didn't go there to partake in the whatever it was that was going on in there. I simply went to get something. So for me, whatever circumstance I find myself in, I've learned to use that as an opportunity to engage. And my thoughts are, if I could engage one person and share something with regard to Judaism that I don't know, maybe that's why I'm there.
Well, and it's all about intention, and you have the proper intention. Now, Hertz has this to say before we dive into the text. Ellen is trying to log in but can't. I don't know why. That's what Sarita says. I will send her the link again.
She's
but
in. She's in now.
She's on.
She's in.
Okay. All righty. There she is.
I'm so sorry. My computer's like freaking out. It's not working. So, but I can hear you guys. It just,
No problem.
it's
Very good.
being
Yep.
weird. Sorry.
Ellen, are you? I can see you. Can you hear us? Can you hear us? Shake your head or nod or something. Ellen? I don't think Ellen can hear us. Anyway, we're going to continue. Like I said, Hertz has this to say. The tribes of Reuven, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh desire to settle east of the Jordan. They protest their willingness to accompany the other tribes until Canaan is conquered. Eastern or Transjordanic Palestine is 150 miles long. Its breadth varies from 30 to 80 miles. It is throughout over 2,000 feet above sea level with a temperate climate, a land of health and fertility. The middle region, Gilead, borne perfume and medicine for the whole Eastern world. Gilead is covered with forests and its valleys by orchards and vineyards. Even more famous was its pasture. Flocks and pastures have ever been the wealth, the charm, the temptation of Eastern Palestine, a land of opulence and insecurity. So, as we will see from a simple reading of the text, I don't know that Reuven and God's intentions were to go into a land that was less spiritual than the land of Israel with the desire or intent to elevate that land. I think it was purely material, and I would think Moses agreed with me, and the text, I think, bears that out. So we are now in chapter 32, the request of Reuven and Gad, verse 1. Very large herds belong to the children or tribes of Reuven and Gad, an extremely large number. They saw the land of Yazir, the land of Gilead, and behold, the region was an area for livestock. So right off the bat, very large herds, extremely large numbers, an area for livestock. So you can see what the overarching concern of these two tribes was. So verse 2, the tribes of Reuven and Gad came and spoke to Moshe, to Eleazar the Kohen, and to the princes of the community, saying, verse 3 and 4, Ataros, Divon, Yezier, Nimrah, Cheshbon, Elali, Savam, Nevo, Beon, the land that Adonai struck down before Bnei Yisrael as an area for livestock, and your servants have livestock. So the many cities and surrounding areas are uniquely suited for livestock, and your servants possess much livestock. They're talking about, again, the land that was recently conquered from Sichon and Og, Midianite kings. 5, they said, Reuven and Gad, that is, the tribal leaders, if we have found favor in your eyes, let this land be given to your servants as a possession. Do not bring us over the Yarden or the Jordan. So Moses says to the tribes, children tribes of Gad and Reuven, and notice the order is reversed. It's not Reuven and Gad as in the previous verses, but now it's Gad and Reuven. And I don't know if there's any importance or significance of that, but it's always interesting to point out these unique changes in order. Should your brothers go out to war while you settle here. So Moses's neck hair is already rising. Okay, so verse 7 to 13 are now an account of the episode of the spies. Why do you dishearten Bnei Yisrael from crossing over the land that Adonai has given them? This is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to look at the land, which of course is a reference to the spies. They went up to Nachal Eshkol, saw the land. They then disheartened Bnei Yisrael from coming into the land that Adonai had given them. Adonai displayed his anger on that day, and he swore, saying, none of the men who came up from Egypt will see, those who are 20 years and above, the land that I swore to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, for they did not follow me fully, except for Caleb, son of Yefuneh, the Kenizzite, and Yehoshua, son of Nun, because they followed Adonai fully. So verse 13, Adonai displayed anger against Israel. He made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the end or death of the entire generation that had done evil in the eyes of Adonai. So, Moses is starting to build his argument. Well, you sound just like the spies here, the 10 spies that didn't want to go into the land. History seems to be repeating itself. Ellen, can you hear me? Okay, very good. 14, behold, you have now risen in the place of your fathers as a group of sinners to add to the wrath of God against Israel. 15, if you will turn away from following him, he will place them in the wilderness. He will again place them in the wilderness. You will destroy this entire nation. So you're putting the whole nation of Israel in jeopardy when we're on the cusp of going into the promised land by requesting this land east and not having to cross the Jordan and fight with us. They, the tribes of Reuben and Gad, approached him and said, Moses, that is, we will build enclosures for our flocks here and cities for our children. We will arm ourselves rapidly and will be ready to go before Bnei Yisrael until we have brought them to their place. Our children will dwell in fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. So they're saying we will build enclosures for our flocks and cities, for our children, and then arm ourselves to fight. So they are basically acceding to Moses's request. Now there's a lot to unpack here by the order of what they're stating, etc. And this is what we were going to unpack as we go through the text. So verse 18, we will not return to our homes until each person of Bnei Yisrael takes possession of his hereditary property. So they acquiesced to Moses's demand. 19, but we do not want to take possession with them across the Yarden and beyond, for our inheritance came to us to the east of the Yarden. So they'll help conquer the land, but they don't want the possession of that territory in the land. They want Sichon and Og's territory that was conquered, where it's very fertile and great qualities for livestock. So 20, Moses's reply, 20 to 22. Moses said to them, if you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before Adonai and go forth to the war, and notice this is this is how legal scholars act. When they hear something, they repeat what they heard to make sure there's no misunderstandings. And you see this time and time again in the Torah. If you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before God and go forth to the war, and every armed man will cross the Jordan before God until he has driven his enemies before him. 22, and the land is conquered before God. Afterwards, you will return. You will then be vindicated from Adonai, from Israel, and this land will become yours permanently before God. So Hertz says this. The idea contained in this phrase, clear before the Lord and before Israel, became a general moral maxim among the rabbis. Man should be clear not only before God, but also in the estimation of his fellow men. It is not enough that a man's conscience is pure. He must strive to make even his outward actions irreproachable and above suspicion. A man should avoid doing things that appear wrong. So the rabbis got a moral dictum based on this interchange of between the two tribes, Moses and the Kohen and the leaders of the community. Now, that's what will happen if you do comply. And remember, it was 14 years for the conquest of Canaan. 7 years in battle, 7 years in allotment of the territories. So that's a long time. Now, I can't tell you if Reuven and Gad were able to go back to east of the Jordan after the 7 years of conquest and not have to wait the other 7 years of allocation of the land. But at the minimum, it was 7 years before they saw their families again.
As I understand it, it took 14 years before they got back.
Okay, thank you. So verse 23, but if you will not do this, behold, you will have sinned against God, and you must realize that your sin will find you. What's the saying? Sin lays crouching at the door. You can't hide from Mother Nature, right? Build for yourselves. Now, this is very interesting, and I want someone other than Ken, please, to point out the contrast in verse 24. Build for yourselves cities for your children and enclosures for your sheep. But what you have expressed verbally, you must fulfill. Anyone?
Go back to 16 to pick it up.
What did I emphasize at the beginning of the Parshah?
I wasn't here, but I know it was about, if you say you're going to do something, do it. About oaths, laws and oaths.
No, ma'am.
No, those laws and oaths have nothing to do with this.
No, ma'am.
Okay.
Let's go back to verse 16.
Verse 16 reads, pens and flocks shall we build for our livestock and cities for our small children. And 24 reads, build for yourself city for your small children and pens for your flock.
It emphasizes the people
difference?
first. It emphasizes the people. You take care of your family before you take care of the flock. Because the people, your family are more important.
So
What?
Reuven and Gad were only interested in their cattle, where Moses rebukes them and says, build for yourselves cities for your children, and then enclosures for your sheep. They valued their possessions more than their families. Okay. Now, people, you got, every word in Torah, it's there for a reason. And you have to be able to pick up on these subtleties, because that's huge. That's very, what is Moses saying to them without coming right out and saying it? By reversing the order, he's telling them, shame on you, shame. In fact, Moses accepted their proposal, but made a few subtle changes. One of them was the order of priorities. They spoke first of their livestock in verse 16. Moses insisted that the children come first. What should be intuitive, apparently was not. And we know people like that who value their possessions more than their own family. That's why I always laugh at the dictum, blood is thicker than water, until the will comes out.
And roller skates are more important because you get to the house first and get what you want.
Not me. I'd trip and skin my knee and hurt myself. Yeah. Okay. So verse 25, the tribe of Gad. Again, here's the reverse order. The tribe of Gad and the tribe of Reuven said to Moshe, saying, your servants will do as my master instructs. So they speak as one. It doesn't say our master. It says my master. So they're speaking with one voice.
It's interesting because the Hebrew says the children of God and the children of Reuven. It doesn't say the tribe, although it's open to interpretation because, it reads B'nai Gad and B'nai Reuven.
Right. Well, and we know that B'nai could mean children or it could mean people.
Right, but generally,
Yes.
I think the emphasis in this case was on children.
Because they certainly were acting like it, weren't they? So 26 and 27, they now recap their promise back to Moses. Our children, notice the order. Our children, wives, and cattle. Nice to know that the wives are ahead of the cattle. This time around anyway. And all livestock will remain there in the cities of Gilead. And your servants will cross over, all those in the army, before Adonai to the war as my master commands. So they've just recapped their promise to Moses. Notice their initial was, let us cross and go over. We don't want any part of the Jordan. You all go fight and have a good life together.
The other interpretation is that they actually had never intended, that there was never an intention not to go and fight. It was just worded poorly. And when they encountered Moses and discussed it, they reworded their plan to make it fit with everything else.
And Ken is being the right and proper Jew and always looking at someone in the most favorable light possible. Thank you. And especially, what a great lesson for Lashon Hara. Even when we hear something, even if it's true, we're supposed to not believe it to be true, and that we can always look at someone in a favorable light. So 28 through 30, Moses is getting this promise from them. Will Moses go over into the land to lead the Israelites in the battle? No, he knows that he will not live to supervise the arrangement. So he's going to command Eleazar, Yehoshua, and the tribal leaders to do this. Okay? Moses commanded to them, Eleazar HaKohen, Yehoshua ben Nun, the heads of the tribes of Bnei Israel. He said to them, if the tribe of Gad and Reuven will cross, the Jordan with you, every man that is armed for battle before God and the land is conquered before you, you shall give them the land of Gilead as a permanent possession. 30. But if they do not cross over with you armed for battle, then they shall take possession among you in the land of Canaan. So there you have it. Now, Nehemiah has this to say, Mammon or Eretz Yisrael. This Sidra discusses, among other things, a highly topical issue touching on the problem of or dilemma between the choice of a career, personal advancement, or the fulfillment of a mission. It is a choice which has faced and continues to face Jewish youth, especially those intent on discharging the cardinal precept of settlement in the land of Israel. We find the application of the term chalutzim to the quote unquote armed men of the 2.5 tribes who agreed to help their brethren conquer the Holy Land. That term has now entered the everyday vocabulary of Jews the world over and has come to represent the pioneer who deliberately forsakes all considerations of career for the mission of building with his own hands the future of his people in Eretz Yisrael. It is now a platitude to say that the state of Israel was built up by generations of such chalutzim. In chapter 27, we find highly significant negotiations taking place between those members of the 2.5 tribes privileged to constitute the first generation to enter the promised land, and Moses, the veteran leader of Israel, father of the prophets who led his people out of Egypt and for 40 years in the wilderness. Here we are confronted by two diametrically opposed points of view. There were those whose interests revolve around material possessions, concern for their cattle, who lived on bread alone and saw not the hand of God. In contrast to them stood the one who never for a moment forgot the divine mission that he had been charged with, and the way the Almighty had brought his people out with signs and miracles thus far. Transjordan had been conquered, and the Israelites stood by the plains of Moab and had only to cross the Jordan to possess the land promised them by the Almighty. But again, an obstacle presented itself. This time it was not the report of spies attempting to dissuade them from entering the land, of yearnings for the flesh pots of Egypt, but a desire to settle down comfortably in the first stretch of fertile, cultivated country that they encountered, rather than move on into the promised land. This time they were deflected from their goal, not by the paradise they considered they had left behind them, but by the ones in which they found themselves. And as we read in chapter 32, verse 1, now the children of Reuven and Gad had a very great multitude of cattle, etc. Note that this verse sums up, as it were, the spiritual outlook of the children of Reuven and Gad, as beginning and ending with cattle. The Reubenites and Gadites forthwith address themselves to Moses. A careful study of their words reveals they made in reality two distinct approaches to Moses. First approach, the children of Gad and Reuven came and spoke unto Moses and to Eleazar the priest and the princes, saying, and they list all the lands, even the country which the Lord smote before the congregation of Israel as a land for cattle, and your servants have cattle. And they spoke, if we have found favor in your eyes, let this land be given to your servants for a possession. Bring us not over the Jordan, which were verses 2 to 5. What is the significance of the twofold nature of their address implied in the repetition of the introductory Vayomru, they spoke? At the outset, they merely placed the facts of the situation before Moses. We have cattle. Here is a land ideal for cattle. They were sounding Moses. They paused and waited for Moses to make the next approach, and perhaps himself suggest what they had not as yet been bold enough to ask for. But no such advance was forthcoming from Moses. So they plucked up courage and broached their suggestion as delicately as possible, as in verse 5. And they said, if we have found favor in your eyes, let this land be given to your servants for a possession. Bring us not over the Jordan. Moses thereupon poured forth a torrent of rebuke and reproof on them, making comparisons with the backsliding of their parents, recalling past history from which they had evidently learned nothing. Full of foreboding for the future and concern for the divine mission they had been charged with, he demanded above all an equal sharing of responsibility with their brethren, which we read just a moment ago. Shall your brethren go to war and you all sit here? After the 2.5 tribes had discussed matters among themselves, they present new proposals to Moses. And they came near to him and said, they made their well-known offer to go up as chalutzim, armed at the head of the camp, with their brethren into the land in exchange for inheriting Transjordan to be allotted immediately to their women and children. Moses accepted their proposals, repeated them in his own words with significant emendations. The proposals as worded by the 2.5 tribes of Moses are placed here side by side for comparison and contrast. So first I'm going to read what the tribes propose and then Moses's response. Back and forth. Tribes. They came near him and said unto him, we will build sheepfolds here for our cattle, cities for our little ones. Moses said unto them, if you will do this thing, if you will go armed before the Lord to war. Because Moses always knows everything that we do is always with Adonai in mind. We do what we do before the Lord. The tribes counter, but we ourselves will go ready armed before the children of Israel until we have brought them into their place, and our little ones shall dwell in the fenced cities of the inhabitants of the land. Moses responds, and we'll go all of you armed over Jordan, again, before the Lord, until he has driven out his enemies before him, and the land be subdued before the Lord. Then afterwards you shall return and be guiltless before the Lord. You see a pattern here? And before Israel, and this land shall be your possession. What? Before the Lord. Back to the tribes. We will not return unto our houses until the children of Israel have inherited every man his inheritance. Moses' response. But if you do not do so, behold, you have sinned against the Lord. And be sure your sin will find you out. And then finally, the tribes say, for we will not inherit with them on yonder side Jordan or forward, because our inheritance has fallen to us on this side Jordan eastward. Moses responds, build your cities for your little ones, your sheep pens, and do that which you hath proceeded out of your mouth. Now back to Nehemiah. The abyss separating their two outlooks stands revealed here. The 2.5 tribes saw it in the light of a quid pro quo between themselves and the rest of Israel. They would contribute their share in helping to conquer the land, and in return would be allotted the region they desired. Not so Moses. He stated everything's in terms of responsibility to and dependence on God, who alone drives out the enemy and apportions the land. We are just God's vessels, instruments. One more variation between Moses and the tribe's declaration is noted by Rashi, echoing midrashic sources, which again is characteristic of the spiritual chasm separating the two sides. They place their concern for their cattle, material possessions, before concern for their little ones. Moses corrects them. Here are the actual words of Rashi. They evinced more concern for their own money than their sons and daughters as they placed their cattle before their little ones. Said Moses to them, do not so. Put first things first and secondary things second. Build you first cities for your little ones and afterwards folds for your sheep. End quote. Moses does not argue with them over this, but quietly corrects them in the course of giving his resume of their declaration. Do they take the hint? Let us study their reply. So verses 25 to 27. And the children of Gad and Reuben spoke unto Moses, saying, thy servants will do as thy Lord commandeth. Our little ones, our wives, our flocks, and all our cattle shall be there in the cities of Gilead. But thy servants will pass over, every man armed for war, before the Lord to battle, as my Lord says. Note their concluding refrain, as my Lord says, not as we originally stated. They agreed against their will to Moses's proposals. A similar picture portraying them as the embodiment of worldliness and material greed is evoked by the Midrash. So here's what the Midrash has to say. Now the children of Reuven and Gad had much cattle. 3 gifts were created in the world: wisdom, strength, and wealth. Wisdom, strength, and wealth. If a man is privileged to possess one of them, he can attain as his own the most precious things in the whole world. If he is privileged to possess strength, he has attained everything. If he is privileged to possess wealth, he has attained everything. When does this apply? When they are gifts of heaven and come by dint of Torah. But the strength and wealth of mortals are naught, as is borne out by what Solomon says. Quote, I returned and saw under the sun, which you know right away is from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, very famous verse, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happens to them all. Jeremiah, in the same strain, says, quote, thus saith the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might. Let not the rich man glory in his riches, but let him that glorieth glory in this, that he understands and knoweth me, meaning God. These gifts, when they do not emanate from the Holy One, blessed be he, will ultimately fail a man. What an important lesson. Our rabbis taught 2 wise men arose in this world, one in Israel and one among the Gentiles. Achitophel in Israel. Achitophel was a beloved advisor of David HaMelech, and David recounts his sweet counsel in Tehillim until Achitophel turns against him and unites with his foes. And Bilam among the nations of the world. And both of them were destroyed from the world. Similarly, 2 strong men arose in the world. Shimshon in Israel, Goliath among the Gentiles, and both of them were destroyed from the world. Likewise, 2 rich men arose in the world, one in Israel and one among the Gentiles. Korach in Israel, Haman among the Gentiles. Both of them were destroyed from the world. Why? Because their gifts emanated not from the Holy One, blessed be he, but they snatched it for themselves. Likewise, in the case of the children of Reuven and Gad, you find that they were rich, possessing large numbers of cattle, but they loved their money and settled outside the land of Israel. Consequently, they were the first of all the tribes to go into exile, as is borne out by the text. And he carried them away, even the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half tribe of Manasseh, which is recounted in Chronicles. What brought it on them? The fact that they separated themselves from their brethren because of their possessions. Where can we infer this? From what is written in the Torah, chapter 32, verse 1, now the children of Reuven had much cattle. A very, very insightful and
Question.
meaningful. Yes.
I don't understand. Well, okay. I don't understand how a human can snatch wisdom, snatch strength, snatch wealth. I can understand that. But snatching wisdom and snatching strength, I don't understand how a human can do that.
All you have to do is look at history. If people do so for their own aims and not to serve or honor the Lord, wisdom is available. I mean, look at wisdom literature, the Jews. I mean, that wasn't exclusive to the Jews. The Greeks, the Romans, many ancient societies had wisdom. Strength, look at the Greeks with their agora, their games, and the Olympics, which come from the Greeks. It's the reason behind it, the purpose behind it. That's what counts. So when we do it for the right reasons, when we learn, for the person who just studies Torah so he can learn about the Torah and then doesn't inculcate it into his daily life, that is snatching. So it just depends on what your reason or intention is behind the wisdom, behind the strength, behind the wealth. So did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So anybody else before we move on? So verse 31 and 32, the tribes of Gad and Reuben answered, saying, as God has spoken to your servants, so shall we do. We will not cross over armed for battle before God to the land of Canaan, and we shall then have our permanent inheritance on this side of the Jordan. So verse 33, I'm going to read from Kohot. Bear with me, I got to get there. So Moses gave the land on the east side of the Jordan to the descendants of Gad and the descendants of Reuben, and half, that is, part of the tribe of Manasseh, son of Joseph. Specifically, Moses gave the former kingdom of Sihon, king of the Amorites, to the tribes of Reuben and Gad, and the former kingdom of Og, king of Bashan, to 2 of the 8 clans of the tribe of Manasseh. So when we speak of the half tribe of Manasseh, it's not literally 4 tribes. It doesn't mean half of the tribes. It means 2 of the 8 clans. The tribe of Manasseh had not requested any land on the east side of the Jordan. But Moses realized that the tribes of Reuben and Gad were correct in assuming that if he were involved in possessing the land, it would strengthen the people's control over it. He took their reasoning one step further and reasoned that his involvement and its positive effect would be even more pronounced if he planted some other part of the Jewish people in their land on his own initiative. He had given the former kingdom of Sihon to the tribes of Reuben and Gad, but the former kingdom of Og lay unclaimed. This land was the land of Rephaim, part of the land that God had promised to give to Abraham's descendants when they first conquered the land, not in the messianic future. So the tribe of Manasseh was famous for its devotion to the land of Israel. So Moses specifically chose them to express the people's hope and aspiration to inherit the land in full. So he sent some of the good with the other 2 tribes in the hopes that they would be able to elevate them spiritually by dividing the tribe in 2 and giving half an inheritance on the west side of the Jordan, half an inheritance on the east side. Moses demonstrated that this tribe did not receive its portion on the east bank of the Jordan because it did not want to live in the land proper. Indeed, the majority of the tribe crossed the Jordan and settled on its west bank. For as we just said, 6 of the 8 tribes did so. Moses gave these 2.5 tribes all the land mentioned together with the cities within its borders, the city of the surrounding territory. Now, Hertz says the half tribe of Manasseh. The sub-tribes of Manasseh were pure warriors who had taken the most prominent part in the conquest of the Gileadite districts. The word half in the phrase half tribe of Manasseh is not to be taken in a precise arithmetical sense. It denotes a section. According to chapter 27, verses 29 to 32, there were 8 sub-tribes of Manasseh, 6 of whom were allotted territory west of the Jordan. So you've learned a lot this morning, including the half tribe of Manasseh doesn't mean literally half of the tribes. And Moses, being the greatest prophet who ever lived, knew that if he left Reuben and Gad there to their own devices, they would just descend spiritually and disappear. So he's hoping by sending 2 of the tribes of Manasseh with them that they would have at least a decent chance. And as we know, when the Assyrians invaded and started exiling the population, Reuven and Gad were the first of the two that were exiled and lost to eternity. So let's see, verse 34. Well, I'm sorry. Where was I? Verse 34, yes. Well, I'm going to read 33. I read that already. Forgive me. 34. The sons of Gad built up Divon, Ataros, Aroer, Atros, Shofan, Yazier, Yogbacha, Beit Nimrah, Beit Haran, as fortified cities and sheep pens. The tribe of Reuven built up Heshbon, Elalai, Kiryasayim. So verse 38, Nevo, Baal Meon, their names having been changed, and Sivma, they retained the names of the other cities that they built. So the names of some cities, which, why were they changed? I'm going to tell you. Nebo, Baal Meon, the names of the latter two having been changed by the tribe of Reuven, since they were originally named after idols. Well, that's obvious. If you're a member of the one true God, you're not going to say, I live in a city named after an idol. That would not end well. And Sivma, which is the name as Sivam mentioned above, for they changed the names of the cities they built in order to emphasize the fact that they had now come into Jewish possession. So, you know, Alexander, he created the city that he conquered and changed the name to Alexandria, which later became Constantinople. But it was very common when land was conquered that the names of cities were changed. So now come additional conquests in 39 through 42, and we will end with Parshah Mattot. The sons of Machir, son of Manasseh, went to Gilead and captured it, which further lends credence that they were mighty warriors, and drove out the Amorites who were in it. Moshe gave Gilad to Machir, son of Manasseh, and he settled in it. Well, that makes sense. He conquered the city, his tribe. They had by rights to take possession of it. Yair, son of Manasseh, went and conquered their villages and called them Chavos Yair. 42. Novach went and conquered Kinas and its suburbs and called it Novach after his own name. When the very famous Jew, I think his name was Henry Leavitt, who created the first suburbs known to mankind in New Jersey, what did he name the city?
Levittown.
Thank you.
You talk about conquering a territory and changing its name. The most perhaps now has become infamous because when the Romans captured Judea,
yes,
they changed the name and it became Syria Palestina, which now has totally different implications.
Yes, sir. Indeed. Very germane. Yes, thank you. Any questions or comments on Mattot before we move on to Masai?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Does anyone have thoughts with regard to the safety of the children and the wives and the sheep and the cattle after the mighty warriors crossed to lead the conquest of the promised land? Any thoughts about how these individuals, weak and helpless, were taken care of while the 14 years passed?
Yeah, they had they had God's glory over them. Besides the fact they were fortified cities, so they were walled cities. And again, God protected them while the men were away.
What happened in temple times during the 3 pilgrimage festivals? The
Same
men
thing.
were obligated to go to Jerusalem, leaving the women and children alone, and God promised that they would be taken care of. It's the same thing.
Just like when the land lies fallow, and God promised that, again, it's all has to do with faith in God.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So now we come to Messiah.
I have a question, Stuart.
Yes, please.
I think I heard you say that Alexandria was renamed Constantinople.
Yes.
I think Istanbul in Turkey is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. You are correct. Thank you for correcting me.
All right.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes, you are correct. I don't
No
claim
problem.
to always be right, but if
Yeah.
I'm wrong, I will admit it. And thank you. At least you're paying attention. Thank you very much.
Sure. No problem.
So, to Messiah, journeys, which means journeys. And we're on chapter 33, verse 1 through 49. And I'm going to start with the Kahot overview, and then we will dive into the text. At the end of Parshat Chukat, the Israelites arrived at the threshold of the promised land by the Jordan, opposite Jericho. The ensuing 3 Parshiot, Balak, Pinchas, and Mattot, describe the events that took place while the Israelites were encamped at their final stop, most prominently the encounter with Moab and Midian. This Parshah, Messiah, the last of the book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, opens with a recapitulation of the Israelites' trek from Egypt until the final camp. And it takes its name, which means the journeys of, from the opening words of this recapitulation. This summary would seem to be a fitting way to close the book. But the fact that the text continues after this review, which is outside of the second triennial, and as Ken pointed out, he emailed a map of the journey through the desert last night. I did get it. I'm sure everybody else did, and thank you for sending it. All he did was hit reply all to the Torah study link, and it had the map with it. And indeed, the entire book of Deuteronomy is yet to come, indicates that it serves rather as the demarcation between the story of the sojourn in the desert and the preparations for returning the land of Israel. After looking back at what was, we look forward to what is about to be. And we do that in our own lives. And indeed, the remainder of Messiah deals with specific instructions pertaining to the conquest of the land, driving out its idolatrous inhabitants, delineating its borders, designating who will divide it up, specifying where the Levites will live and the special role their cities will play, detailing additional laws of inheritance. So it would seem that the opening subject of the Parshah is entirely different from the rest of its contents. If the opening review of the Israelites' itinerary is the end of the story of the desert, perhaps it should have been placed at the end of the previous Parashah. The present Parashah would then be entirely devoted to the life of the people would lead after crossing the Jordan. The fact that despite what we think, the itinerary is part of the look ahead and actually introduces it, implies that it is at least as relevant to what is to come as it is to what was. The distinguishing feature of human life is change. What do we say all the time? The only thing that remains the same is the change. Things will change. True, lower life forms also grow, learn, and adapt. But once they reach maturity, they remain what they are. Even the forms of life above us, the angels, are static. Every angel is the eternal, unchanging personification of a specific level of divine consciousness or emotion. Only human beings are capable of changing their way of looking at life, of progressing to higher, more divinely conscious levels of living based on their expanded understanding of reality. If this spiritual growth is a unique property of human existence, it follows that in order for us to remain human and avoid becoming fossilized as a stagnant animal or even angel, this process must go on continuously. We must always strive to expand our spiritual horizons and seek higher levels of living. The secret of life then is to keep moving, to keep journeying upward, never to look at progress only as a phenomenon of the past, but to see it primarily as an integral part of the future. As we have seen, the archetype of constricted consciousness is the land of Egypt. The Hebrew name for Egypt, Mitzrayim, means limits or boundaries or constraints. The exodus from Egypt is thus the archetype for transcending limits in the spiritual life. But here we find an instructive nuance in the way the Israelites' itinerary is introduced. Quote, "These are the journeys of the Israelites who left the land of Egypt," end quote. This phrase seems to imply that all the journeys were from the land of Egypt, while technically only the first journey was from Egypt. By introducing the entire itinerary this way, the Torah teaches us that whenever we go out of Egypt, whenever we transcend one level of life, we should consider our new expanded level of consciousness a new Egypt, a level of constricted awareness relative to where we want to go next. In this way, we are constantly going out of Egypt. What's the old saying? One door closes, another door opens. Furthermore, rather than simply listing the stops on the journey, the account is phrased in a way that emphasizes how the Israelites left every place they stopped at. They journeyed from Ramses and camped at Sukkot. They journeyed from Sukkot and camped at Etam. They journeyed from Etam, etc. This implies that every progression from level to level must be a quantum leap. It is not enough to just enhance or ascend at our present level. Each leg of the journey should be a complete departure from the previous way. We conceived of God, of life, and of ourselves. In this context, it is particularly instructive to realize that not everything that happened along this journey from Egypt to the threshold of the promised land was altogether positive. Well, we know that. At quite a few stops, the Israelites fell backwards, even retreated, and learned the lessons of divine living the hard way. Nonetheless, they are all called journeys. In the long run, they all contributed to the final arrival. I often tell people I wouldn't be who I am if I wasn't who I was. And that's true for all of us. This teaches us that in order to progress in life, we must learn how to see every regression as a lesson and how to progress further, and thereby turn every failure into a success. There can be no ascent without a descent, right? This is possible because despite the imperative to progress continually, there are certain things that should not change. This is the lesson we learned in the previous Parshah, Mattot. These basic concepts, our fundamental beliefs, our resistance to evil, are the bedrock of our spiritual lives, give us stability on which we can base our continuous ascent. In particular, we can survive our falls when we realize that they are orchestrated by divine providence. Hishkacha pratis. We fall specifically in those areas of life where God sees we need to ascend. The rest of our life remains intact, providing the framework we need to put ourselves back together. When I look back at some of the challenges that God put before me, I realized that those were areas that I needed to work on to improve myself and my character. But only by descending was I able, with honest reflection, to ascend.
Well, that's one of the reasons that we're told in all things rejoice, which is not a good, easy thing to do when you're in a bad place.
Yeah.
But we're able to rejoice because we have confident assurance that we're going to get through this, okay? And then if we have the capability of thinking that, okay, I'm going to go through this and only positive is going to occur. I don't know how, I don't know when, but at some point positive is going to occur. That really helps one to be able to rejoice, even though you don't think you feel like it.
Very true. And that's the point of what this overview is saying. These lessons were particularly pertinent when the Jews were about to enter the promised land. The safe and sequestered life of the desert, of seclusion in a totally spiritual environment, naturally encourages spiritual growth. Of course, it is possible to stagnate in a spiritual environment as well, but the main challenge to remain spiritually alive is in the settled land of mundane material living. That's the true challenge, everyday life. It is therefore fitting to make this point just as our sights become focused on working the land across the Jordan, so that we remember throughout our mundane lives to strive and progress constantly toward even higher levels of divine consciousness. By ascending the ladder of spiritual growth ourselves and helping others make the same climb, we actualize the lessons we learned in the desert and successfully meet the challenge of making the world into God's home. So when you think, golly, this is so irrelevant, the listing of journey after journey after journey. That's the lesson, the insight behind it. So 1 through 49, which is the rest of the portion for study this morning, is the itinerary from Egypt to Jordan. So I want to read this introduction from Hertz before we get into the text. This chapter supplies us with the stages of the journey of the Israelites from Egypt to the plains of Moab. It was written to serve as a memorial, not only of historical interest, but of deep religious significance. Every journey, every halting place had its suggestions for the instruction, admonition, and encouragement of Israel. The Midrash says, it may be likened unto a king who has taken his ailing son into a distant place to be cured. So here's a marshal, which I talked about last week, which Mishlei Proverbs means. A marshal is a parable, and the king is often the median for the parable. And this is the wisest of all men, King Solomon's method for teaching. So the king had taken his ailing son to a distant place to be cured. On the return journey, the king would lovingly recount to the lad all the experiences they went through at each of these halting places. At this spot, we slept. At that, we had a cool resting place from the heat. At the other, you were overcome with pains in the head. Israel is God's child, upon whom he bestows compassion, even as a father bestows compassion on his son. So, these are the journeys of Bnei Israel, who went out of Egypt in organized groups under the leadership of Moshe and Aharon. So it's interesting that the text reflects organized groups because it's understood because they were arranged by tribe. And you had certain tribes on the east, on the south, on the north, on the west, and the Levites in the middle. But organized groups means of one mind, of one spirit, under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. So Rashi says, why are these journeys recorded? To make the omnipresence benevolence known. For although he decreed to them to move about and caused them to wander in the wilderness, do not say they wandered and were moved about from journey to journey all 40 years and had no rest. There are only 42 journeys here. Subtract 14, all of which took place during the first year, before the decree. So before the sin of the spies, there were 14 journeys. From their journeys from Ramses until they reached Rizmah, from where the spies were dispatched, as it is said, after the people journeyed from Chatzeros, etc. They journeyed from Chatzeros and camped at Rizmah. You learn that it was the desert of Paran. Exclude further from there 8 journeys, which took place after Aaron's death from Mount Hor, to the plains of Moab during the 40th year, it is found that throughout the 38 years, they only took 20 journeys. So people who just read the Torah, and again, the written Torah, it cannot be understood without the oral Torah. It seems like that God took these Israelites on a wild goose chase, and then they never had time to rest. Well, remember, after Korach rebellion, they stayed in the same place 19 years. So these 42 journeys, yes, happened over 42 years. And sometimes they were there for a year. Sometimes they were there for a few days. But that's what Rashi wants you to understand. So verse 2, Moshe recorded their departures for their journeys, according to God's command. These were the departures for their journeys. So Moses wants you to know that this is important to God, that we remember where we came from before we know where we're going. And how can any of us know where we're going without knowing our past? Verse 3, they journeyed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the month. Well, we know that was at Passover, right? The 15th of Nisan, on the day after the Korban Pesach. Bnei Yisrael left triumphantly before the eyes of all the Egyptians. So they left Egypt in a public display. It was not clandestine in any way. God took them out before all the eyes of the Egyptians. 4. I mean, what an important lesson just in that one verse.
But not only all of the Egyptians, all of the other nations of the world, since there were so many people coming out from Egypt, which was a very prominent country at that time. So any movement like that from Egypt, not only the Egyptians, but other nations of the world were fully aware that this was occurring.
And we know that from the book of Judges, when Rechab hides the 2 spies, because they knew that they were going to be conquered, because they knew of all the wonders that God had done on the Jews' behalf. So verse 4, Egypt was burying their dead, that which Adonai had struck among them, all their firstborn, and on their idols Adonai had inflicted punishments. And that was the 10 plagues, to show that God's power is greater than any of their gods.
Actually, it would also represented the destruction of the idols that
Correct.
occurred.
Yes. So verses 5 to 15 detail the stages from Ramses to Mount Sinai. So here we go. Bnei Yisrael journeyed, or again, as the Kahot emphasizes, how they left one place to camp in another, from Ramses and camped in Sukkot. Ooh, that sounds like a holy day, a festival. They journeyed from Sukkot and camped in Etam, which is on the edge of the wilderness. 7, they journeyed from Etam and turned back to Pi Hahiros, facing Baal Zephon, and they camped by Migdal.
In 7, interestingly, the Hebrew says, they journeyed from Etham and it turned back.
Yeah.
And the question is whether did the Jews become unified, or was it the pillar of fire that turned? So
yes. So verse 8, they journeyed from before Hachiros, crossed amidst the sea toward the wilderness. Oh, what sea would that be, I wonder? They traveled for 3 days in the wilderness of Etam and camped in Marah. which we know was one of the first complaints about water. Marah means bitter. So just like when I say 9/11, I don't have to say anything more than that, because you all were around during 9/11 and immediately images come to your mind and you know what took place then. So God doesn't need to say, at Marah, where you rebelled against me for not having water. All they have to do is mention the different places, just like the king. And then your memories are evoked, right? So it's the same thing here. They journeyed from Marah and came to Elim. In Elim were 12 springs of water. And we know from the book of Shemot the significance of 12 springs of water with the 12 tribes, 70 palm trees representing the 70 nations, and they camped there. 10, they journeyed from Elam and camped by Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. 11, they journeyed from Yam Suf. They camped in the wilderness of Sin. 12, they journeyed from the wilderness of Sin and camped in Dafika. 13, they journeyed from Dafika and camped in Alush. Now, there's not a lot of commentary on these journeys because it's pretty straightforward. They journeyed from Alush and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water there for the people to drink. So again, here you go. They journeyed from Rephidim, they camped in the wilderness of Sinai, Bamidbar Sinai, which of course is the name of this whole book of Torah, Bamidbar, wilderness, desert. So now we've gotten to the foothills of Mount Sinai. So 16 to 36, I want to read what Hertz has to say. At this distance, it is exceedingly difficult to identify the exact route of march, more especially as the names were not names of cities or conspicuous landmarks. They have changed with the centuries, and the designation of the temporary landmarks was forgotten.
That points out an interesting concept, because there are actually several potential routes that they may have taken. And in fact, there's even one suggestion that they crossed Sinai Peninsula. And if you look on that map where 30 and 31 are, it's where it's, I think it's Avronan, Etzion, Gever. There's some suggestion that was the area where they crossed Yam Suf, because the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba are actually just two forks of there's two branches. They're one body of water, and both are referred to as Yam Suf. And there's an alternative that Sinai is actually somewhere in the Arabian Peninsula.
And of course, topography changes over time. Look at the Dead Sea then versus the Dead Sea today. Of course, man had a lot to do with the Dead Sea evaporating away.
Yeah, but it was still called the Salt Sea in the Torah.
Correct. Okay, moving on. 16. They journeyed from Bamidbar Sinai, camped in Kivrot Hata'avo. 17. They journeyed from Kivrot Hata'ava, and camped in Chatziros. They journeyed from Chatziros and camped in Rizmah, which, according to Rashi, was named after the spies' slander. So now you have a point in your head where they are. and an activity that took place at that place. 19. They journeyed from Rizmo, camped in Ramon Peretz. They journeyed from Ramon Peretz, camped in Livno. They journeyed from Livno, camped in Risa. They journeyed from Risa, camped in Kehelata. They journeyed from Kehelata and camped in Har Shefer. And Har means mountain or mount. So Mount Shefer, wherever that is. They journeyed from Har Shefer and camped in Harada. They journeyed from Harada and camped in Machelot. They journeyed from Machelot and camped in Tachat. Not Tachas, Tachat. They journeyed from Tachat and camped in Tarach. 28. They journeyed from Tarach and camped in Miskah. They journeyed from Miskah and camped in Hashmonah. They went from Hashmonah and camped in Moserot. They journeyed from Moserot and camped in Bnei Ya'akan. So the people of Ya'akan, or children of Ya'akan. They journeyed from Bnei Ya'akan and camped in Hor Hagidgah. Hagidgad, excuse me. 33. They journeyed from Hor Hagidgad and camped in Yatvata. They journeyed from Yatvata and camped in Avronah. They journeyed from Avronah and camped in Etzion Gaver. 36. They journeyed from Etzion Gaver and camped in the wilderness of Sin, as opposed to Sin. And it's confusing because you got Bamidbar Sin, Samach Nun, or Sin, Tzedek Nun, final Nun, which is Kodesh. And to confuse you even more, Kodesh is not the same of the Kadesh of the spies, for that was in the wilderness of Paran and is referred to here as Ritma, which I said back in verse 8, alluded to the spies according to Rashi. So Ritma is in the wilderness of Paran, which is not the same as the Kadesh. The arrival at the Kadesh of this verse occurred on Rosh Chodesh Nisan of the 40th year from the Exodus. It is here that Miriam died and where it was decreed that Moses and Aaron would not enter the land. So that's where this Kadesh is. So verse 37, they journeyed from Kadesh and camped in Hor Hahar. So the mountain of the mountain at the edge of the land of Edom, which is, of course, the Edomites. 38. Something significant happens here again. Then Aaron HaKohen ascended Hor Hahor by the word of God and died there in the 40th year of Bnei Yisrael's exodus from Egypt on the first day of the 5th month. Ba'echad lachodesh. Aaron was 123 years old at his death on Hor Hahor. Remember, Moses was 120. I don't believe they tell us how old Miriam was. Do you know, Ken?
No, but I'll try to find out.
That would be interesting to know. So Aaron was 123, Moses, his baby brother, 120, and Miriam, Ken is on the prowl. Sherlock Ken. Ken Monades. So, verse 40. The Canaanite, the king of Arod, heard, he dwelt in the south of the land of Canaan, that Bnei Yisrael was approaching. They journeyed from Hor Hahor and camped in Salmonah. They journeyed from Salmonah and camped in Punan. They journeyed from Punon and camped in Ovos. They journeyed from Ovos, camped at the ruins of Avarim on Moab's border. So we know we're getting close to where they are now, because they were on the edge of Moab looking over into the promised land. They journeyed from the ruins and camped in Divon Gad. They journeyed from Divon Gad and camped in Almon Divlatama, excuse me. They journeyed from Almon Divlatama and camped in the Avorim mountains before Nebo. 48. They journeyed from the Avorim mountains and camped in the plains of Moab along the Yarden near Jericho, which is right where they are now. They camped along the Yarden from Beit Yeshimos until Aviel Hashittim in the plains of Moab. So that's the end of our Torah study.
I have a comment to make with regard to Ken's pointing out the difference between the they and it turn. And what came to my mind was the it was the cloud.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, it was?
That's one interpretation. Yeah, there were two interpretations of it. One is it was the cloud, the pillar of fire or the cloud, and the other it was that the Israelites came as a unified group.
Anybody else before we go on to the Haftorah? Well,
yes, I'm glad you read that. And I did not attempt to read that out loud. I can say a lot of things in my mind for pronunciation of a word, but that does not mean it's the correct pronunciation.
Yeah. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you later.
If Moses died at 120 at the end of the 40 years in the desert, Miriam died a year earlier, and she was 6 years older than Moses, if I remember the time correctly. She would have been 124 when she 125, 124, 125 when she died.
Well, you know, that seems incredible, but when I was a child, living past 70 was incredible. That's why Social Security became eligible at 65, because people didn't live much past 70, and we only had to pay for their benefits for 5 years.
Actually, Social Security was started early enough that the lifespan was even lower than that. So they weren't paying out much Social Security at 65.
Okay.
Early on.
So now look at today. How common is it to see a centurion? People are more and more common to live 100 years or older. So
I remember years ago when Willard Scott used to have people celebrating 100, and there'd be like one a week. And now every day there are quite a few.
Yes, ma'am. True indeed.
I prefer to live only by the enabling power of our Creator, the Eternal One, rather than to have to depend on man and what God has given man to give as medicines, because they didn't have to take medicines. They didn't have to have surgery.
But you
Well-
got to consider that if God didn't want us to have the medicines and prolong our lives, we wouldn't be prolonged. Our lives.
I
would be
understand, but
prolonged.
I said I prefer, because
Yeah.
I've had a lot of medicines and I've had a lot of limbs cut on so I can live. So give
You're
it a
still here.
preference,
But you're still here.
but my preference would have been able to live like they did, which
Yeah,
was
but-
And I
different
would-
from
and
the way
I'm-
we live now.
In biblical time, I don't know how old you are, Patricia, but in biblical times, you would have been dead a long time ago, because
Right.
35 or 40 it was not an unusual age to die at that time.
And
it was
think
old
about childbirth. Even today, it's that women, babies die in childbirth as much as a quarter of the time. I'm not sure the exact statistic, but back in ancient times,
It was not.
it was very common that not only did the baby die, but the mother died in childbirth.
That's why a Hebrew name wasn't given to girl babies till 30 days. And
Right,
boy babies, obviously, at 8 days, because babies didn't survive.
correct.
Viability was very, very slim.
So now I'm going to switch gears because I want to get in the Haftorah while we can. There's no thematic connection from last week's Haftorah through the high holidays, up until the high holidays. After the 17th of Tammuz, when the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Babylonians, and we start reading 3 Haftorot of admonition from the book of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Why would you think we would read from the prophet Jeremiah? Anyone besides Ken want to venture a guess? Who is credited with writing the book of Lamentations? Echa.
Yeah. What are you talking about? Oops, sorry.
Who is credited with writing the book of Lamentations? Hebrew is Echa. No one knows who wrote the book of Lamentations. What do we read on Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in Jewish history?
Is that Kohelet?
Lamentations. Boy, your assignment, everyone's assignment on the 9th of Av is to read the book of Lamentations.
But did you tell us who wrote it?
Can you figure it out?
It's
Jeremiah.
Very good. I don't know how
Jeremiah.
much of a hint I could have given.
Way to go, Janet.
Even-
Yay.
Even
You're all
the,
making things way too difficult here.
even
Way
the,
too difficult.
even the one of the Haftarot uses the same trope as Lamentation.
Correct. Correct. So Lamentations, of course, is Jeremiah's just sadness over the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the exile of his people, which he spent 40 years prophesizing would happen. So that is why we read all 3 Haftorahs of admonition from this prophet. Now, next week, of course, will be the 3rd Haftorah of admonition. Now, just a technical point, this Shabbat, we should actually be reading the Haftorah for Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, right? Because Saturday is Rosh Chodesh Av. But even then, we don't read that because of the 3 weeks of admonition have to be read before Tisha B'Av. You all know the answers to some of these. I refuse to believe it. Just have confidence in yourself and don't make it as difficult as it is. Especially with all the little gems I put out on the field for you to just gather and collect.
I think sometimes we're just afraid to be wrong.
Don't be afraid to be wrong. I was wrong. I called Alexandria Constantinople. Okay?
And none of us caught that except for Ken. So you see,
No, it
No,
was
Phil caught that.
no, Phil caught it.
I knew there was something wrong, but I just didn't remember what the right name was.
Well, and his wife grew up in Egypt. So gosh, I would hope Phil would be well aware of these types of things. But anyway, so we're reading from the prophet Jeremiah Yeshayahu, which is chapter 2, verse 4, which is where last week's left off, chapter 2, verse 3, through 28. We finished the chapter 2, and then just one line from chapter 3, because the Haftorah never ends in a sad or negative note, but always on a note of hope or uplift. Now, if you're in Hertz, you're on page 725. So verses 4 through 13 are Israel's ingratitude in return for God's love. I mean, that's a common theme among the prophets, and especially Yirmiyahu. What book did Yirmiyahu write? Very good. Lamentations. Echa.
I thought it was the dictionary.
Yeah. No, that's Webster.
Oh, close. Sounds close.
Yeah.
Jeremiah, Webster, you know.
Yeah. Hear the word of God, house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. Verse 5. So Jeremiah is addressing the nation as a whole, even though, and he includes the families of the house of Israel. Now, if you know your history, there is no house of Israel. The Assyrians conquered Israel in 720 before the Common Era. This is taking place around the 6th century of the Common Era. Thus says God, what wrong have your fathers found in me, that they have removed themselves from me, pursued nothingness and became nothingness themselves? So God is the ultimate asker of the rhetorical question, because that's a rhetorical question. 6 and 7. Before I read the verses 6 and 7, I want to read, well, I'll read them and then what Hertz has to say. And they no longer said, where is God, who brought us up from the land of Mitzrayim, who guided us in the wilderness through a land of desolation and peril, through a land of drought and the shadow of death, through though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. Through a land that no man has passed through, and where no man has yet dwelt. So Hertz says, shadow of death or deep darkness. Just as in the deep darkness, men cannot see their way and stray blindly hither and thither, so in the trackless desert, they may easily lose themselves and wander in bewilderment. 7. And yet, I brought you into a fertile land to eat of its fruit and its goodness, but you came and defiled my land and turned my heritage into an abomination. So let's look at fertile land. Verse 7, Na'avi etchem el eretz ha-Carmel. Oh, Carmel in Israel, fertile land. There it is, Eretz ha-Carmel. Hertz says, a garden land, the land of fields, vineyards, and well-wooded spaces, the land I selected for my divine purpose. But by imitating the savage and immoral practices for which the old inhabitants of Canaan were driven out, that's what's going to happen to you. 8. The priest did not say, where is God? So first he's admonishing the people who no longer said, where is God? Now he's saying specifically the priests. They didn't say, where is God? And those that handle the Torah knew me no more. So the priests were indifferent to God's will. And who was responsible for teaching Torah to the people? The Levites. The shepherds deserted me. The prophets prophesied for Baal, Nevi Sheker, the false prophets. Sheker is false. And so they went after that, which is of no avail. Vanities of vanities, Kohelet said. 9. Therefore, I will have to contend with you without cease, says God. Even with your children's children will I contend. And that came to pass because the exile lasted 70 years before the people returned and rebuilt the second temple. 10. Then pass on to the distant land of the Kittites across the sea and look about. Send to Kedar. And the Kedar was an ancient Arab tribe. And David HaMelech speaks of the tents of Kedar in the Psalms. And consider diligently whether such a thing has ever happened before. So Israel's defection from God will be the cause of its grievous constant suffering. So from the farthest west to the remotest east, the nation's history shows no parallel for such apostasy. 11. Has a nation ever changed its gods and yet they are not gods? My people has surrendered its honor for that which is of no avail. Israel was only too eager to surrender that which constituted its greatness and glory in exchange for delusions. And we see this in Psalm 106, verse 19 through 22, which recounts the history of Israel. They made a calf in Horeb, which is another name for Sinai. They prostrated themselves before a molten image. They exchanged their glory for the likeness of a grass-eating ox. They forgot God, their Savior, who had done great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham, awesome things by the Sea of Reeds. So what it seems like the people haven't learned a whole lot, have they? They're just repeating their past mistakes. Those who do not learn from the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. And that still happens today. We don't learn. I guarantee you there'll be another winter Geddon in Texas because our politicians haven't learned the lessons of what happened in February. They rather concentrate on other things that have nothing to do with what their main purpose is to protect us. 12. Be astonished, heavens, at this. Rage and lay waste exceedingly, says God. 13. For my people has committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the source of living waters, Mayim Chaim. We've heard that phrase before. To dig for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot even hold water. So they exchange me for the likeness of a grass-eating ox. Could there be a more devastating condemnation of the audacity shown by this generation? It has abandoned the pure, everlasting source of living waters offered by God's law of salvation, sought to replace it with self-conceived notions, which, like broken cisterns that cannot even hold the water poured into them, bear the mark of human frailty. Transient, they vanish, crumbling beneath the hands of those that yearn for fresh and living waters. Verse 14 through 17, Israel sins and consequent calamities. 14. Is Israel a servant or a homeborn slave? Why has he become a prey? So is he a servant of God or a slave to the idols, to the heathens, to the pagans? Lions roar against him. They raise their voices, have made his land desolate. His cities are burned, empty of inhabitants. The prophet pauses for a moment and reflects on his people. They have already become the victim of the neighboring nations. Enemies are advancing from every direction, threatening the land that must fall prey to their greed. Can this be the purpose for which Israel received from God the gift of national independence? Did God bestow freedom upon Israel only so that this people should become the slave of other nations? 16. The sons of Noph and Tachpanes too are smashing your skull. Well, these are two cities in Egypt. And it was in Tachpanes that took Yirmiyahu by force after the fall of Jerusalem. Remember, those of you who were in synagogue Saturday or live streamed, I said Jeremiah went to Egypt with some of the exiles after the destruction, where he was not heard from again. We don't know what happened to him. And that's what happens when we make alliances with our enemies. Because Israel, Judah made alliances with the Assyrians, with the Egyptians, in the hopes of battling the Babylonians instead of relying in God. 17. Truly, you owe it to this, that you have forsaken God your God, and he sought to lead you on the right path. So now 18 and 19 are the folly of foreign alliances, which I just spoke about. And now, what is it that draws you to the path to Mitzrayim, to Egypt? Is it perhaps to drink the waters of the Nile? Well, those are the broken cisterns. And what is it that draws you to the path of Ashur, Assyria? Is it perhaps to drink the waters of the river? So the commentary says, oh, I already read that, forgive me. So, oh, wait a minute, here I go. God expects that the blows of fate which have already befallen Israel would bring it to its senses and show it the way back to God. But this does not happen. Israel turns to Egypt, hoping to repel its enemies by contracting an alliance with that great power. Does Israel perhaps yearn for the waters of the Nile? With biting sarcasm, the prophet alludes to the downfall of the northern kingdom, whose tribes now sit mourning on the banks of the Euphrates, by the rivers of Babylon. Well, although this is the Euphrates, which the Assyrians dispersed the northern tribes, because of their disastrous policy of courting Assyria's friendship as a security against threats from neighboring nations. Perhaps this reminder will serve to open Judah's eyes at last. Well, we know the answer to that. So verse 20 to 25 is obstinance in idolatry. From time immemorial, I wish to break your yoke and burst your bands, but you said, I do not want to cross over to you. Instead, you strut about on every high hill and under every verdant tree as a harlot. So, of course, they're talking about the Ashtaroth. God is, Jeremiah is. The trees that become idol worship, the places of idol worship, and the verdant, the high hills. So again, Jeremiah is saying, you want to run to the girl with the pretty dress instead of staying with your wife who's been faithful to you. 21.
Translation in Hearst that you have for that particular verse,
20.
Thank you. Where it is recorded that the response to the eternal power was, for thou sayest, I will not transgress upon every high hill and under every leafy tree. To me, they're saying, well, I'm going to do this, but I won't be in the process of transgressing and disobeying you, even though I'm doing this. And, you've told us that we shouldn't do this. I mean, that's an interpretation that I have from the way it was quoted in Hearst.
Well, what God is referring to again are the Ashtaroth, the high trees that were worshipped by the pagans, and the hills. They were areas of idol worship.
I understand, but
Okay.
it appears they were justifying doing that because they're saying, well, I'm not really disobeying you by doing this. I'm not doing this. I'm not disobeying you. But then because the eternal power responded, you did recline and play harlot.
Yeah,
You see what I'm saying?
sure. Just like a man would say, well, my wife is not romantic with me, so I'm going to get romance somewhere else. Okay. So, but honey, I didn't fornicate. There were other ways to have pleasure without actually coitus. And forgive me for talking like this, but that's basically what people do to justify their actions.
Clinton, I did not have sex with that woman.
Right. There you go. She was under the desk the whole time. So, 21. And yet, I had planted you as a noble vine of a seed, genuine through and through. How then have you turned on me into the degenerate shoots of a wild vine? I don't know how much more plain Jeremiah could say these things, which is why he was so wildly popular for 40 years and people tried to kill him and threw him in prison. So verse 9 in Psalm 80, because the seed, of course, is Abraham Avinu. I had planted you as a noble vine of a seed. Abraham was the seed. So verse 9 says, you caused a vine to journey out of Egypt. You expelled nations and implanted it. You cleared a space before it. It struck its roots and filled the land. Verse 22. Though you were to wash yourself with nitra, which is soap, nitra, and took much soap, the guilt of your sin stands stained before me, says my Lord, the God who reveals his loving kindness and justice. So what does the unfaithful man do? He comes home and puts his clothes in the laundry to wash off the lipstick on the collar. But the sin stays with him. Okay? No matter how much soap you use to cleanse yourself, you're not going to get rid of the sin. There's no outward means of purification that will remove your guilt. 23. How can you say, I have not defiled myself? I did not go after the idols of Baal. See your path in the valley. Recognize what you have done. Reckless young horse, forever changing its path. So, the Lord, according to Pirkei Avot, or according to our sages, God strengthens those who want to do good. God does not stand in the way of those who want to do evil. So if you're bent on doing bad and evil, God won't stand in your way. That's what free will is about. 24. Wild creature, child of the wilderness. In the greed of its desire, it snuffs the wind. Who could restrain it from striving? May all who attempt it not grow weary. Perhaps they will yet find it in its renewal. So the commentary has this to say. The prophet's bold analogies bring out in sharp relief the picture of a corrupt nation. First, he sees it as a reckless young horse, capering hither and yon. But now he perceives it as a wild, untamed beast of the wilderness, snorting madly, a picture of ferocious, half-crazed passion. Does anyone have the courage to block the path of this animal in hopes of restraining it and distracting it from its course? Try it, is the anguished cry from the prophet's heart, filled with passionate love for his unfortunate, deluded people. His call goes forth to all those who will not despair or tire in their endeavors to bring the people to its senses. Perhaps they will succeed. Perhaps they will live to see the moment of the people's renewal. awakening and healing. 25, pray, withhold your foot from nakedness and your throat from thirst. But you say, no hope, no, for I love the strangers, and after them I will go. So Israel has abandoned herself to her sinful ways. 26 through 27, the futility of idols in time of trouble. As the thief is ashamed when he is caught, so will they be ashamed someday. The house of Israel, they, their kings and their princes, their priests and their prophets, who say to a piece of wood, you are my father, and to a stone, you have given me birth. For they have turned their neck to me and not their face. Well then, in the time of their trouble, let them say, arise and help us. Kuma v'hoshienu. Kuma, arise. Hoshienu, save us, help us. So only when it's too late do people then say, save me, help me. So the futility, and you're looking at this, and I'm reminded of the Psalms again. They have eyes but cannot see. They have mouths but cannot speak. They have nose but cannot smell. They have ears but cannot hear, etc., etc. And then 28. Where are your gods that you have made for yourself? Let them arise if they can help you at the time of your trouble. For the number of your cities have become your gods, Judah. So evidently there were a lot of cities in Judah, which meant they were a lot of gods too. So someday, gazing upon the ruins of its past glory, Israel will understand at last the impressive words with which the prophet described the lamentable state of his generation. Lamentable, lamentations. Oh, the number of your cities have become your gods, Judah. So now chapter 3. Verse 4. So this is going to be very interesting because from the you called the idols father. Now in verse 4, come from now on, call me father. You are the guide of my youth. So God is Father and guide. The promise of abundant blessing is still in store for those who will decide to call God Father and accept him as their guide through life. And that's the positive note that this Haftorah ends, the second Haftorah of admonition.
Okay, this states in, I'm sorry, Ken, go ahead.
In the Nusach Sefarad, they actually continue with two more lines, which read, if you will return, O Israel, the word of Hashem to me, to me shall you return, and if you will remove your abomination from before me, and you will not stray, but you will swear as Hashem lives, in truth, in justice, and in righteousness, then shall the nations bless themselves in him, and in him shall they sing praises themselves. So interesting, it's just one more positive on that same note.
It's interesting because the Ashkenazim read chapter 3, verse 4, and the Sephardim read chapter 4, 1 and 2, which Ken read.
They read both. It's an extension.
Okay.
It's an addition.
So that's
I have two things to say. I have two things. Okay. In chapter 3, verse 4, where it has thou, okay, didst thou not just cry unto me, my father, thou art the friend of my youth. So does that mean that the people were including their cry to God, that not only was he their father, but also their friend from their youth?
What it means is for those Jews who instead will not call all the idols father, but recognize that God is the Father and accept him as their guide through life.
Okay, so thou art the friend of my youth. They're actually saying you are the guide from my youth. Huh,
Yes.
And also that
interesting.
they believed in God all their life. They never lost their faith in God.
So
In
that,
addition, I'm glad that Ken brought up the chapter 4 because, you know, it states the condition that don't think this is going to happen without you being responsible for doing something, which is a common thing that we're taught and understood. If we will do something, then things will happen positively for us. But if we don't, don't expect it to happen
well, that
anyway.
that was the whole meaning behind the Haftorah that we just read, that Israel must admit its guilt and stop its egregious behavior, repent and return to God. And we're
I
a
have
few
another
minutes.
comment. That is the what you talked about with regard to when we first started this Haftarah, chapter 2, verse 4.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, you said something about the nation of the Judah was the one that was being addressed because Israel.
There was no nation of Israel when Jeremiah lived.
Okay, so
The Assyrians,
okay.
the Assyrians had conquered Israel and exiled its population 150 years before.
Okay, that's what I thought you said. Okay, so the thought that came to my mind for Jeremiah to prophesy in this manner and include the house of Israel is in keeping with the fact that the house of Israel were scattered, you know, out all over the world. So you could not say that this is the nation Israel, like you could say this is the nation Judah. Nevertheless, it implies that at some point, this group will be brought back together and identifiable as the nation of Israel at some point in the future, which I think is occurring now.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're told when the Messiah comes. But also, you got to keep in mind that there were Jews that during the Assyrian exile went south into Judah. Okay, so some of the 10 tribes still lived in Judah until the Babylonians basically destroyed everything and sent and exiled the entire population. But there were northern kingdom Jews that lived in the southern kingdom. So anything else?
Well, I have a question for everybody else. Stewart's was bouncing sort of up and down for me on my screen. I have a new iPad, so I need to really find out if I'm having a problem.
No,
did anybody else experience?
That was me with my table doing this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I only have 14 days to get this back.
Yeah. So maybe you had a fifth on the fourth.
No, it was a gallon.
Oh, okay.
You know, it's beyond my understanding why from the beginning of our time, we always seem to pose a threat to people. When we were not a militant people, we never did anything. Well, I shouldn't say we never did. We did invade other people and kill other people. But I don't understand why from the beginning, people have always sought to destroy us.
Because you're trying to approach something that is emotion-based logically. There is no logic to hate. You can't reason with hate. So they're parallel lines. So to try and grasp hate from a logical perspective, that's a tautology, and you'll drive yourself into insanity. It's
well,
just,
if you think of it in those terms, then if we are parallel, I don't know that we'll ever come together, because if you can't eradicate hate, which you can't, how will there ever be peace for us?
That's the
I mean,
messianic world, Janet.
I mean,
That's what the prophets promised time and time again through the coming of Mashiach.
that means
And
we have,
we can all bring the coming of the Messiah and hasten it by the performance of mitzvot. Every mitzvah you do, just think, if the one mitzvah you did turned the scales and brought Messiah.
we're
And you
such a
have to keep
small
that
group
in the
of
back
people.
of your mind.
You know, we're such a small group fighting such a huge group of people. You know, my mother-in-law used to say to me all the time, Jews will never be liked, will be tolerated. I mean, she said this to me like 30, 40 years ago, and I didn't really understand, but it's true. It's true, and it's so sad.
Well, when the Messiah comes and godliness is revealed in the world, all the nations will come to Israel. The prophets tell us this time and time again. They will all see and want to learn from the Jews.
Yeah, other religions have prophets too, so, you know, we don't know what they prophesied, whatever. Yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
Well, I wish everybody a good week and thank you for your time and attention and participation. And when next week, when I ask, why are we reading from the book of Jeremiah for the third Haftorah of admonition, I expect a rousing, rounding response from my participants.
There you go.
There you go.
Thanks,
Well,
Stuart.
thank you so much,
Thanks.
Stuart. Wonderful.
Thank you,
all.
everyone.
Thank you
Stuart.
all.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, all.